distances in some cases. So a round of applause to yourselves as well for coming here. I will keep my comments brief because I certainly do not have the experience and the expertise in Egypt specifically that some of the people here have that you've heard from. But what I do share is a lot of the same interests and a lot of the same passions for a lot of the same issues. And what I find fascinating about speaking to these people, and I have them in my studio today, is it certainly opens up your eyes to the struggles and the challenges that exist in 2014 in parts of the world that we as Americans will never understand what that's like. And no matter how bad things get in the United States, we'll never really understand what that's like. And I'm a talk radio host, and as many of you probably know who listen to talk radio and pay attention to the American media, cable news and talk radio in the United States is full of a lot of people who will claim that their rights are being stripped away, and they complain about our elected leadership, and they complain about our president, and they hearken back to the Nazis and Germany and all of this. And when I hear them saying this so many times, I just laugh to myself and I think, how do you even have a radio show right now? You're on the air right now expressing how you have no freedom. Now, I was not alive in the 1930s in Germany, but I'm pretty sure talk radio did not exist under Adolf Hitler. And if it did, the last thing he would probably allow you to do is to go on national airwaves, public airwaves, and denounce him. And we have that right in the United States. We have it right now. But we spend a lot of time, I think, sometimes complaining that we don't have those rights. And I think it's a little bit ironic. I think it's a little bit disingenuous. And I just think part of the problem is you can become so complacent and so comfortable that you don't, again, realize some of the very real struggles that people go through in other parts of the world. When I see what happens in the Middle East, and again, I am not, in the Muslim world and in the Middle East, I am not the expert that many of you are here today, but you know, certain things come to mind. Number one, listening to the speakers speak here today, clearly, obviously, democracy is not a very easy thing, and it's also easy for me to say that, but to really understand what I say by that is because right here we see a banner. This is the legitimate president of Egypt. He's not in power right now. And we can't explain why that is. We have our own administration. Our president is sending money to a military group that is not the elected leadership in Egypt. We see the same problem with the Palestinian people. Hamas is the democratically elected leadership of the Palestinian people. The United States doesn't really want to recognize that. Israel doesn't really want to recognize that. I certainly understand the apprehensions that they have about Hamas, but it is the democratically elected leadership. And so many times I hear people say, whenever I talk about the Middle East, if I talk about the Muslim world, I'll have people call into my show, and they'll make the point sometimes that, well, maybe there's parts of this world that just aren't ready for democracy. You look at the sectarian violence in Iraq. Maybe the Iraqi people just aren't ready for democracy. And you look at some of the sectarian violence in a place like Syria. Maybe the Syrians just aren't ready for democracy. I think the interesting question that the Western world, the United States, needs to ask itself, and I don't think we ask it very often, is, are we ready for democracy in some of these parts of the world? Because they have democratically elected leadership right now that we refuse to recognize. So that's a big question. Are we in the Western world ready for democracy in some of these places? I oftentimes like to draw an analogy to a place where I do have a lot of experience. I lived in Ireland for 3 years, and to anybody who follows these processes, peace processes, and sectarian violence in regions of the world where we have had these problems, obviously Northern Ireland is a classic example, where you had all of the exact same problems that you see across the Middle East, that you see across the Muslim world. You had the sectarian violence, you had religious violence, murder, imprisonment, hundreds, thousands of people being rounded up, killed, imprisoned against their will. This was all happening in the United Kingdom 15 years ago, 20 years ago. In 1998, all sides decided to get together and literally, like flipping a light switch, they just decided that we're not going to do it this way anymore. Now, what did that really mean? They came together, they put together a government. The people who sit on the government today are, in some cases, terrorists. Sinn Féin is the elected leadership of the IRA. It's the elected leadership of the Irish Catholic section of Northern Ireland. And I'm an Irish Catholic myself, but I can tell you right now that the IRA was terrorists. They were. And they were killers. And some of them were really mean killers. And one of those killers today is the First Minister of Northern Ireland. His name's Martin McGuinness. And when I see the problems that happen in the Middle East and everybody, we scratch our heads and how do we figure this out? We already have a blueprint as to how to figure this out, and it's Northern Ireland. But unfortunately, I think a lot of us don't really want to go about it the way that they did in a place like Northern Ireland, because what they did in Northern Ireland is they put all of their differences aside, despite the killings, despite the violence, despite the terrorism, and offered everybody a seat at the table. There are terrorists seated at the table in Northern Ireland. Now today, when we look at what's happening in different parts of the Muslim world, well, we can't acknowledge Hamas. They're terrorists. Some people would say we can't acknowledge the Muslim Brotherhood. They're terrorists. Whether you believe that or not is really, in many ways, completely irrelevant. If you support democracy, that's it. They're the democratically elected leadership. The hatred that existed in Northern Ireland in that day, in a lot of ways, was even worse than what you see today in a lot of parts of the world. But they literally, and it was a miracle the way they did it, just decided to put that all behind them. And finally, the people got sick of it, and they started to invest in their communities, and they started to build up their economy. And today, there's a good economy, there's good jobs, people are educated. They don't have any more reason to kill each other, even though they were doing that just 15 years ago. And so they came together in 1998, and things just changed. And so when I see what's happening in Egypt right now, you see what's happening, especially, I think, the situation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I think there's a blueprint already in place, but it's an ugly blueprint. It's a little bit uncomfortable. It's not easy, and it requires all of us recognizing who is the true democratically elected leadership. We will not agree with them on everything. There's a good chance maybe we'll agree with them on nothing, which is the case in Northern Ireland. The two sides literally agree on nothing, but they still run the country together. That's a difficult blueprint to follow, I think, for a lot of people. But the answers are there. And when you talk about the media, I'm a member of the media myself. I don't think the media in the United States does a very good job of covering this. Obviously, Amir, you would have some experience with this. So many times the media will just, well, they'll repeat the talking points that have been provided to them. And that's, as we discussed today on the air, is a lot of what's happening in Egypt today. So, you do need some outside voices and some outside-the-box thinking to kind of shed some new light on some of this. The good news, I think, is that there are blueprints in place, and there are people here who do understand what your people are going through and what a lot of people go through all across the world right now. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people who are completely ignorant of that or do not want to maybe admit that it is happening. But if we're all being truthful with ourselves, and we all want to be truthful with ourselves and recognize the very real struggles that these people go through, and how it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself and repeating itself and repeating itself because we're not learning our lessons from the previous cycles. If we can all be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that, I think the way forward is not quite as difficult as maybe we would think it is. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Again, my education and expertise on Egypt specifically, not as deep as some other people here, but those are my thoughts on I think the situation that we find ourselves in, because I think it's a situation that has been repeated many times. I think the blueprint is there, and I think we can solve these problems if we have the courage and the honesty to do it.